Victoria Martinez stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 5:30 in the morning, trying to cover the dark circles under her eyes with makeup. She had been awake until 2 a.m. the night before, hunched over her laptop taking online music theory classes after finishing her shift at the restaurant. Her fingers were still sore from practicing piano scales on the old keyboard she had bought from a pawn shop 3 months ago. The keyboard wasn't much to look at. Half the keys stuck, and it didn't even sound like a real piano. But it was all she could afford on her waitress salary, and she was determined to keep her musical skills sharp. Every morning, she would wake up before dawn to practice for an hour before getting ready for work. Her neighbors probably thought she was crazy, but Victoria didn't care. Music was the only thing that kept her going during these difficult times. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Miguel had a good night. The new medication seems to be helping." Victoria smiled for the first time that morning. Her 18-year-old brother Miguel had been battling a rare blood disorder for the past year. The treatments were expensive, even with insurance, and Victoria had taken on extra shifts at the restaurant to help pay for his medical bills. She looked at the acceptance letter pinned to her wall. Juilliard School of Music, she had received it 8 months ago, along with a partial scholarship. But even with the scholarship, she couldn't afford the remaining tuition and living expenses in New York. The letter was starting to fade from the sunlight, streaming through her small apartment window. Just like her dreams seemed to be fading with each passing day, Victoria grabbed her server's uniform and headed out the door. The morning air was crisp, and she could hear birds singing in the trees lining her street. She lived in a modest neighborhood, far from the fancy part of town where she worked. The bus ride to the Meridian restaurant took 45 minutes, giving her time to review her music theory notes on her phone. The Meridian was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Rich businessmen brought their clients there for lunch meetings. Wealthy families celebrated special occasions in the elegant dining rooms. Victoria had been working there for 3 months, and she was good at her job. She remembered every order, never spilled a drink, and always smiled even when customers were rude to her. Her manager, Robert, was waiting for her when she arrived. "Victoria, I'm glad you're here early," he said. "Mr. Blackwood wants to see you in his office." Charles Blackwood owned the restaurant, along with half the commercial real estate in the city. Victoria had only spoken to him once before, during her job interview. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive suits. Everything about him screamed money and power. Victoria knocked on his office door and waited for permission to enter. The office was impressive, with leather furniture and paintings that probably cost more than she made in a year. Blackwood was sitting behind his massive desk, typing on his laptop. "Ah, Victoria," he said without looking up. "I have a proposition for you." Victoria stood there quietly, unsure of what to say. She had learned that wealthy people like Blackwood preferred to do most of the talking. "I'm hosting my annual charity gala this Saturday evening at my home," Blackwood continued. "It's a big event. We usually have about 150 guests, all very important people in the community. I need extra servers for the evening, and I'm willing to pay double the usual rate." Victoria's heart jumped. Double pay would mean she could cover Miguel's medication for another month. "I would be very interested, sir," she said. "Good," Blackwood said, finally looking up at her. "The event starts at 7 p.m. sharp. You'll be serving drinks and appetizers. I expect professional behavior at all times. These are sophisticated people, not your typical restaurant customers." There was something in his tone that made Victoria feel uncomfortable, but she needed the money too badly to worry about it. "Of course, sir, I understand." "I certainly hope so," Blackwood said, returning to his laptop. "You can pick up your uniform and schedule from Robert. Don't be late." Victoria left his office feeling both excited and nervous. The extra money would be a huge help for her family, but she had never worked at such a high-profile event before. She spent the rest of her shift thinking about what the evening might be like. During her break, she called her mother to share the good news. "That's wonderful, honey," her mother said. "You work so hard. You deserve some good luck. How's Miguel doing today?" Victoria asked. "He's tired, but his spirits are good. He's been practicing guitar in his room. He says he wants to write a song for you." Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. Miguel had always been musical, just like her. Before he got sick, he was the lead guitarist in his high school band. Now he could barely play for more than 15 minutes without getting exhausted. "Tell him I can't wait to hear it," Victoria said. That evening, Victoria stopped by the music store on her way home. She couldn't afford to buy anything, but she liked to look at the instruments and dream about the day when she might be able to afford a real piano. The store owner, an elderly man named Frank, had gotten used to her visits. "Still dreaming about that baby grand?" Frank asked, nodding toward the beautiful black piano in the corner. "Every day," Victoria replied. "Someday I'll have enough money saved up. You know, I've been in this business for 40 years, Frank said. "I can usually tell when someone has real talent just by watching how they look at the instruments. You've got something special, young lady. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Victoria smiled. Frank's encouragement meant a lot to her. In a world where people often judged her by her job or her clothes, it was nice to meet someone who saw her potential. When she got home, Victoria practiced on her little keyboard for an hour before starting her online classes. She was studying advanced harmony, which was challenging but fascinating. Her professor had commented on her natural understanding of musical structure. If only she could afford to study full-time. She knew she could excel. As she lay in bed that night, Victoria thought about the upcoming gala. She imagined herself moving gracefully through crowds of elegant people, serving expensive champagne and gourmet food. Maybe some of the guests would be kind to her. Maybe one of them would even ask about her music studies. She had no way of knowing that Charles Blackwood had been watching her for weeks, noting her quiet confidence and the way other servers seemed to respect her. He had heard through the restaurant gossip that she had musical aspirations, and he found it amusing. In his world, people like Victoria were meant to serve people like him, not pursue artistic dreams above their station. But Victoria was focused on the positive. The extra money would help her family, and maybe, just maybe, working at such an important event would lead to other opportunities. She fell asleep that night with hope in her heart, completely unaware that she was about to face the biggest challenge of her young life. Saturday evening arrived faster than Victoria had expected. She stood outside Charles Blackwood's mansion at 6:45 p.m., staring up at the enormous house with its perfectly manicured gardens and fountain in the circular driveway. Cars worth more than her annual salary were already pulling up, dropping off guests in designer gowns and expensive suits. Victoria smoothed down her black server's uniform and checked her appearance one more time in her phone's camera. She had spent extra time that morning making sure her hair was perfect and her shoes were polished. This was her chance to make some real money for Miguel's treatment, and she wasn't going to mess it up. The mansion's front entrance was grand, with tall columns and crystal chandeliers visible through the windows. Victoria walked around to the service entrance as instructed, where she met 5 other servers from the restaurant. They all looked as nervous as she felt. Robert, the manager, was waiting for them with clipboards and final instructions. "Remember, these are very important people," he said. "Smile, be polite, but don't try to make conversation unless they speak to you first. Keep the champagne glasses full and the appetizer trays moving." Any questions? Nobody had any questions. They were all experienced servers who knew how to handle wealthy customers. Victoria had served plenty of rich people at the restaurant, and she was confident she could handle this crowd too. The inside of Blackwood's home was even more impressive than the outside. The main room where the party was being held had marble floors, artwork on every wall, and a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. At one end of the room sat a beautiful black grand piano that made Victoria's heart skip a beat. She had never seen such a perfect instrument up close. Guests began arriving in larger numbers around 7:30. Victoria moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne glasses, offering drinks with a warm smile. Most of the guests barely looked at her, which was fine. She was there to work, not to socialize. The women wore jewelry that probably cost more than Victoria's car, and the men had watches that could pay for Miguel's treatment for a whole year. But Victoria didn't feel jealous or bitter. She was actually fascinated by their conversations. They talked about business deals, vacation homes, and charity projects. Some of them seemed genuinely nice, thanking her politely when she served them drinks. For the first 2 hours, everything went perfectly. Victoria and the other servers worked smoothly together, keeping everyone happy and comfortable. She even overheard a few guests complimenting the service to Blackwood, which made her proud. But around 9:30, things started to change. Charles Blackwood had been drinking steadily throughout the evening, and Victoria noticed his voice getting louder and his laugh becoming more forced. He was surrounded by a group of his closest friends, all successful businessmen who seemed to enjoy his attention. Victoria was refilling champagne glasses at a nearby table when she heard Blackwood mention her name. "You see that girl over there?" he said, pointing in her direction. "The one with the dark hair serving drinks?" His friends turned to look at Victoria, who pretended not to notice while continuing to work. Her heart started beating faster. She had learned from experience that when wealthy people started talking about servers, it usually wasn't good news. "She works at my restaurant," Blackwood continued, his words slightly slurred. "Sweet little thing, works harder than anyone else. But here's the funny part. She thinks she's going to be a famous musician someday." His friends chuckled, and Victoria felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. How did he know about her musical dreams? She had never mentioned them at work, except maybe to 1 or 2 other servers during break time. A musician? One of Blackwood's friends said, "That's cute. What does she play, the kazoo?" The group laughed louder, and Victoria desperately wanted to disappear. She tried to move to another part of the room, but Blackwood's voice carried easily across the space. "Oh, it gets better," Blackwood said, clearly enjoying the attention. "She actually applied to some fancy music school. Juilliard, I think. Can you imagine? A waitress thinking she belongs with all those rich kids who've had private lessons since they were 5 years old." Victoria's hand started shaking as she set down her tray. She couldn't believe this was happening. How had he found out about Juilliard? Had he been checking up on his employees? The acceptance letter was private, something she had shared only with her family. Other guests were starting to notice the conversation, turning their heads to see what was so amusing. Victoria felt like she was in a nightmare, standing in the middle of this elegant room while everyone stared at her. "The poor thing probably thinks talent is enough," another friend added. "She doesn't understand that music is a rich person's game. You need connections, expensive training, the right background." "Exactly," Blackwood said, raising his champagne glass. "Some people just don't know their place in the world." Victoria's face was burning with shame, but she tried to keep working. She needed this job, and she needed the extra money from tonight. She couldn't afford to lose her temper, no matter how cruel these men were being. But Blackwood wasn't finished. The alcohol had made him bold, and he was enjoying the laughter from his friends too much to stop now. He tapped his champagne glass with a spoon, making the clear ringing sound that got everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the entire room, "I hope you're all having a wonderful evening." The crowd turned toward him, smiling and raising their glasses. Victoria tried to slip toward the kitchen, but there were too many people in the way. I want to introduce you to someone special tonight. Blackwood continued, scanning the room until his eyes found Victoria. Victoria Martinez, one of our hardest working ... staff members. The way he said staff members made it sound like something dirty. Victoria stood frozen in place as 150 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. She felt like an animal in a zoo, on display for everyone's entertainment. Victoria here has big dreams, Blackwood said, his tone dripping with fake sweetness. She wants to be a professional musician. Isn't that adorable? Some guests smiled politely, not understanding what was happening. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing the cruelty in Blackwood's voice. But his inner circle of friends were grinning, waiting to see what would happen next. Now, I'm all for following your dreams, Blackwood continued, pretending to be supportive. And lucky for Victoria, we happen to have a beautiful piano right here in this room. Victoria's stomach dropped as she realized where this was going. The grand piano she had admired earlier suddenly looked like an instrument of torture. What do you say, Victoria? Blackwood called out, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Why don't you play something for our distinguished guests? Show everyone what a waitress's musical education sounds like. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Every person in the room was staring at her, waiting to see what she would do. Some looked curious, others seemed embarrassed for her, and a few appeared to be enjoying the spectacle. Blackwood stood there with a satisfied smirk on his face, completely confident that he had won. He expected Victoria to run away in shame, probably crying. That would be the perfect ending to his little show, proving his point about people knowing their place in the world. Victoria's hands were trembling as she stood there, holding her serving tray like a shield. This was the moment that would define her future, though she didn't know it yet. Everything she had worked for, everything she believed about herself, was about to be tested in front of 150 strangers who had already decided she didn't belong in their world. Victoria stood in the middle of the elegant room, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. The silence stretched on forever, or at least it felt that way. She could hear someone coughing in the back of the room, and the soft clink of champagne glasses as nervous guests shifted their weight. From one foot to the other . Her mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. She could run. She could drop her serving tray right there on the marble floor and walk out the front door. Nobody could stop her. She could go home to her small apartment, crawl into bed, and pretend this nightmare had never happened. But then, she thought about Miguel. Her little brother was at home right now, probably practicing guitar even though it made him tired. He never complained about his illness, never felt sorry for himself. When the doctors first told them about his condition, Miguel had looked at Victoria and said, "Don't worry about me. You keep working on your music. One of us is going to make it big." She thought about her mother, working double shifts at the hotel just to help pay the medical bills. Her mother had never had the chance to follow her dreams. She had gotten pregnant young and spent her whole life taking care of her family. "I live my dreams through you now," she had told Victoria just last week. Victoria thought about her grandmother, who had saved up money from her housekeeping job to buy Victoria her first piano lesson when she was 7 years old. "Music is in your blood, Mia," her grandmother used to say. "Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't belong there." All these thoughts flashed through Victoria's mind in just a few seconds. The guests were still staring at her, waiting to see what she would do. Some of them looked sympathetic now, as if they were starting to understand how cruel Blackwood's challenge really was. Victoria looked at Charles Blackwood, standing there with his arms crossed and that smug smile on his face. He was so sure of himself, so confident that he had broken her spirit. He probably went to bed every night telling himself he was better than people like her simply because he had more money in his bank account. Then Victoria's eyes moved to the piano. It was the most beautiful instrument she had ever seen. The black surface was so polished she could see her reflection in it. The keys looked perfect, like they had never been touched by uncertain fingers. This was the kind of piano she dreamed about playing someday, when she was a real musician performing in concert halls around the world. Something shifted inside Victoria's chest. It felt like a door opening, or maybe a cage breaking apart. She had spent her whole life being careful, being polite, making sure she didn't cause any trouble for anyone. She worked hard and kept her head down and never asked for more than she deserved. But standing there in that room, surrounded by people who thought they were better than her, Victoria realized something important. They weren't better than her. They just had more money. And money couldn't buy the one thing she had spent years developing. Her talent. Victoria set her serving tray down on the nearest table. The gentle clink of glasses seemed loud in the quiet room. Several guests gasped softly, surprised by her decision to actually accept the challenge. "Oh my," whispered an elderly woman near the front. "She's really going to do it." Victoria's legs felt shaky as she walked toward the piano. Each step seemed to take forever. She could feel every single person in the room watching her, judging her uniform, her hair, the way she moved. Some of them were probably already laughing inside, ready to enjoy her failure. When she reached the piano bench, Victoria paused for a moment. Her hands were trembling, and she pressed them against her legs to try to stop the shaking. She had never performed in front of so many people before. The biggest audience she had ever played for was her family and maybe Frank at the music store. That one time when he asked her to try out a used keyboard. Victoria sat down on the bench and adjusted it to the right height. The piano was positioned so that she was facing most of the crowd, which meant everyone could see her face while she played. There was nowhere to hide. She lifted the piano lid and looked at the keys. They were perfect, ivory white and deep black, arranged in the familiar pattern she had known since childhood. For just a moment, all the fear left her body. This was her language, her way of speaking to the world. These keys understood her better than any person in this room ever could. Behind her, Victoria could hear Charles Blackwood talking quietly to his friends. "This should be good," he said with a chuckle. "I bet she plays chopsticks, or Mary had a little lamb." His friends laughed softly, but Victoria noticed that some of the other guests were shushing them. A few people seemed genuinely curious to hear what she would play. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to calm her racing heart. She thought about all those early morning practice sessions on her broken keyboard. She thought about the online music theory classes she took after work, studying until her eyes burned with exhaustion. She thought about every sacrifice her family had made so she could keep pursuing her dreams. When she opened her eyes again, Victoria knew exactly what she was going to play. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire, a piece that separated real pianists from people who just knew how to play a few songs. She had been working on this piece for 2 years, practicing it section by section on her little keyboard. It told a story of struggle and triumph, of darkness giving way to light. It seemed perfect for this moment. Victoria placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. The room was completely silent now. Even Blackwood had stopped talking, waiting to see what would happen. As her fingers touched the keys for the first time, Victoria felt the difference immediately. This piano was nothing like her cheap keyboard at home. The keys responded to her, touched like they were alive, the sound rich and full and perfect. It was like the difference between speaking through a broken telephone and singing with a full choir behind you. The opening notes of the ballade began to flow from the piano, soft and mysterious like the beginning of a fairy tale. Victoria felt her nerves melting away as the music took over. This was who she really was, not the waitress in the uniform, but the musician who had been hiding inside her all along. In the audience, the change was immediate. The soft conversation stopped. The clinking of glasses went silent. Even the people who had been enjoying Blackwood's cruel joke stood up straighter. Suddenly paying attention, an elderly man near the piano leaned forward in his chair, his eyes wide with surprise. A woman in a sparkling dress put her hand over her heart. Already moved by the haunting melody, Victoria was no longer thinking about the crowd or her embarrassment or Charles Blackwood's smug face. She was lost in the music, her fingers finding every note with precision and grace. The piece was demanding, requiring her to play different melodies with each hand while maintaining perfect timing and emotional expression. But Victoria was ready for this challenge. She had been preparing for it her entire life. As Victoria's fingers continued to dance across the keys, something magical began to happen in that grand room. The soft, mysterious opening of Chopin's Ballade was building into something more complex, more powerful. Her left hand was playing a steady, haunting melody while her right hand added delicate decorations that sparkled like jewels. The guests who had been whispering and shuffling their feet just moments before were now completely still. Victoria could feel their attention like a physical force, but it no longer frightened her. Instead, it gave her energy. Every person in that room was listening to her, really listening, maybe for the first time in her life. Behind the piano, Charles Blackwood's confident smirk was starting to fade. He had expected Victoria to stumble through Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or maybe a simple church hymn. He certainly hadn't expected this level of sophistication. The piece she was playing was clearly advanced, far beyond what he thought a waitress could possibly know. Victoria's fingers moved with increasing confidence as she entered the more challenging sections of the ballade. The music began to tell its story, moments of gentle beauty followed by dramatic passages that required her to play with incredible speed and precision. Her hands were flying across the keyboard now, hitting every note perfectly despite the piece's demanding technical requirements. An older woman near the front of the crowd leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Harold, this girl is extraordinary. Listen to her technique." Harold nodded, his mouth slightly open in amazement. He had attended hundreds of classical concerts in his lifetime, and he recognized true talent when he heard it. The music continued to build, and Victoria felt herself getting lost in the performance. This was why she had fallen in love with piano in the first place, this feeling of being completely connected to something beautiful and powerful. Every emotion she had ever felt was flowing through her fingers into the keys. Her struggles with money, her worry about Miguel's health, her dreams of studying at Juilliard, her love for her family, it was all there in the music. About 5 minutes into the piece, Victoria reached one of the most difficult passages. Her right hand had to play a series of rapid, complex runs, while her left hand maintained the underlying harmony. It was the kind of technical challenge that made even professional pianists nervous. On her cheap keyboard at home, this section never sounded quite right because some of the keys stuck, but on this magnificent grand piano, every note rang out clearly. Victoria's fingers moved with the precision of a master craftsman, each note perfectly timed and beautifully voiced. The difficulty of what she was doing was obvious to anyone who knew anything about piano music, and even those who didn't could sense they were witnessing something special. A middle-aged man standing near the back of the room pulled out his phone and started recording. He had never heard anything like this outside of a professional concert hall. Within seconds, several other guests were doing the same thing, capturing Victoria's performance to share with friends and family. Victoria was completely unaware of the phones. She was deep in the music now, approaching the emotional climax of the piece. The ballade tells the story of a hero's journey, with moments of triumph and defeat, love and loss. As Victoria played, she thought about her own journey, growing up poor, but never giving up on her dreams, working multiple jobs to support her family, studying music late into the night when she should have been sleeping. The music swelled to a powerful climax, and Victoria's whole body was involved in the performance now. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her face showing the emotion of every phrase. This wasn't just technical display. This was storytelling at the highest level. Communication that went beyond words. In the audience, people were having physical reactions to the music. A woman in an expensive evening gown had tears streaming down her cheeks. A successful businessman who hadn't thought about classical music in years found himself completely captivated. Even some of Blackwood's friends who had been enjoying the cruel joke just minutes before were now staring in wonder. Elena Vasquez, a renowned conductor who had been standing quietly near the wall, moved closer to the piano. She had recognized the piece immediately. She had conducted orchestras performing this ballad many times, but she had rarely heard it played with such emotional depth and technical mastery, especially by someone so young. Incredible, Elena whispered to herself. Where did this girl come from? Victoria was now in the final section of the piece, where Chopin brings back the opening theme, but transforms it into something more complex and beautiful. Her interpretation was mature beyond her years, showing an understanding of the music's emotional content that couldn't be taught in any classroom. The technical demands were enormous. Victoria's hands were moving in completely different patterns, her left hand playing deep, powerful chords while her right hand soared above with a melody that seemed to float on air. The coordination required was extraordinary, but Victoria made it look effortless. Frank, the music store owner, would have been amazed to see Victoria now. The quiet young woman who visited his shop to dream about pianos she couldn't afford was revealed to be an artist of remarkable ability. Every hour she had spent practicing on that broken keyboard, every sacrifice she had made to continue her musical education, was paying off in this moment. As the piece neared its conclusion, the energy in the room was electric. People were leaning forward, hanging on every note. Some had never heard classical music performed live before, and they were discovering what they had been missing. Others were experienced concertgoers who recognized they were witnessing something truly special. Victoria's face showed complete concentration as she approached the final passages. The ballade ends with a series of dramatic chords that require the pianist to use the full power of the instrument. Victoria's arms moved with strength and grace, drawing sounds from the piano that filled every corner of the large room. The last section of the piece is particularly challenging because it requires the pianist to maintain emotional intensity while executing some of the most difficult technical passages Chopin ever wrote. Victoria's preparation was evident. She had studied not just the notes, but the meaning behind them. Every phrase had purpose, every dynamic change told part of the story. Charles Blackwood was no longer smiling. His face had gone pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just a waitress who happened to know a little piano. This was a serious musician, someone with real training and genuine talent. The joke was no longer on Victoria, it was on him. As Victoria played the final measures, the room seemed to hold its breath. The piece was building to its dramatic conclusion, a series of powerful chords that would bring the musical journey to its end. Victoria's entire body was engaged now, using every ounce of strength and skill she possessed to bring out the full emotional impact of Chopin's masterpiece. The last chord rang out across the silent room, deep and resonant and perfect. Victoria held it for exactly the right amount of time before lifting her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was profound, not the uncomfortable silence of embarrassment, but the awed silence that follows a truly great performance. For a moment, nobody moved. Victoria sat at the piano bench, her hands resting in her lap, hardly believing what had just happened. She had played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 perfectly in front of 150 strangers, on the most beautiful piano she had ever touched. Then, slowly, the applause began. The applause started slowly, like raindrops before a storm. One person clapped, then Then suddenly the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. People weren't just clapping politely. They were standing up, cheering, and some were even crying. Victoria had never experienced anything like it in her entire life. She sat at the piano bench, still hardly believing what had just happened. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from nerves anymore, but from the adrenaline of having just performed at the highest level of her ability. The beautiful grand piano seemed to glow under the chandelier lights, as if it had been waiting its whole existence for someone to bring out its true voice. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Victoria slowly stood up from the bench and turned to face the crowd. The same people who had been staring at her with pity and amusement just 15 minutes ago were now looking at her with genuine respect and admiration. She had completely changed their perception of who she was in the span of a single musical performance. Near the front of the crowd, Elena Vasquez was clapping with tears streaming down her face. As one of the most respected conductors in the country, she had heard thousands of pianists perform over her 40-year career. She knew exceptional talent when she heard it, and what Victoria had just done was nothing short of extraordinary. Magnificent. Elena whispered to the woman standing next to her. Absolutely magnificent. That girl has a gift that money cannot buy. Elena began making her way through the crowd toward Victoria. She had to speak with this young woman immediately. Talent like this couldn't be wasted serving tables, no matter how noble the reasons might be. Meanwhile, Charles Blackwood stood frozen near the back of the room. His face had gone from smug confidence to pale shock to something that looked almost like fear. He had just humiliated himself in front of 150 of the most influential people in the city. His attempt to embarrass a waitress had backfired spectacularly, revealing his own cruelty and ignorance instead. Several of his guests were already whispering among themselves, and Blackwood could tell they weren't saying nice things about him. A successful businessman named Richard Chun shook his head in disgust. "That was absolutely shameful, Charles," he said loud enough for others to hear. "That girl has more talent in her little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. And you tried to humiliate her." Other guests were pulling out their phones, not just to record what had happened, but to share it immediately on social media. Videos of Victoria's performance were already being uploaded to various platforms, with captions like "Waitress stuns crowd with incredible piano performance," and "This will restore your faith in human talent." Victoria was still standing by the piano, overwhelmed by the continued applause and the stream of people approaching her. A wealthy couple in their 60s were the first to reach her. "That was absolutely beautiful, dear," the woman said, taking Victoria's hands in hers. "Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" I mostly taught myself," Victoria stammered, still not quite believing this was really happening. "I take some online classes, and I had a few lessons when I was younger, but self-taught?" The man interrupted, his eyes wide with amazement. "That's impossible. The technical skill you just displayed takes years of professional training." Before Victoria could respond, Elena Vasquez had reached them. The older couple recognized her immediately and stepped aside respectfully. Elena was a legend in the classical music world, and her presence at the party added even more significance to what had just happened. "Hello, Victoria," Elena said with a warm smile. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I conduct orchestras for a living, and I need to tell you something very important." Victoria's heart nearly stopped. She knew exactly who Elena Vasquez was. She had watched videos of her conducting some of the world's greatest orchestras. Meeting her was like a struggling actor meeting a famous Hollywood director. "What you just did," Elena continued, "was not just impressive for someone your age or background. It was impressive, period. I've heard professional concert pianists play that piece with less emotional depth and technical mastery than you just showed." Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had dreamed of hearing words like this her entire life, But she had never imagined it would happen like this, in front of so many people, after such a difficult beginning to the evening. "I don't understand," Victoria said softly. "How did you know to come tonight?" Elena laughed gently. "I'm a friend of the family that hosts this charity event every year. But I had no idea I would witness something like this. Tell me, what are your plans? Are you studying music professionally?" The question hit Victoria like a punch to the stomach. This was the part of the conversation she had been dreading. How could she explain that she had been accepted to Juilliard, but couldn't afford to go? How could she tell this accomplished woman that she was working as a waitress to help pay for her brother's medical bills? "I was accepted to Juilliard," Victoria said quietly, looking down at her feet, "but I can't afford to attend. I'm working to help my family with some medical expenses." Elena's expression immediately became serious. "What do you mean you can't afford it? Surely someone with your talent would qualify for financial aid." "I received a partial scholarship," Victoria explained, "but it's not enough to cover everything. And my brother is sick, so I need to keep working to help with his treatment costs." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Around them, other guests were still approaching, wanting to congratulate Victoria and ask her questions. But Elena gently guided Victoria to a quieter corner of the room where they could talk more privately. "Victoria, listen to me very carefully," Elena said, placing her hands on Victoria's shoulders. "What you have is not just talent. It's a gift that appears maybe once in a generation. The way you played tonight, the emotional maturity and technical skill you displayed, that's not something that can be taught. It comes from inside." Victoria listened, hardly daring to breathe. "I have connections at several music schools and conservatories," Elena continued. "I also know people who run scholarship foundations specifically for talented students from difficult backgrounds. Would you be willing to let me make some phone calls on your behalf?" Before Victoria could answer, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s approached them. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm David Rodriguez. I run the Henderson Music Foundation. We provide full scholarships for exceptional young musicians who need financial support." Victoria's head was spinning. This felt like a dream that was too good to be true. "I recorded your performance," David continued, showing Victoria his phone. "With your permission, I'd like to share this with our scholarship committee. Based on what I heard tonight, I think we could arrange full funding for your education, including living expenses." More people kept approaching. A music producer wanted to discuss recording opportunities. A piano teacher offered free advanced lessons. A local news reporter asked if she could do an interview about Victoria's story. Across the room, Charles Blackwood was having a very different experience. Several of his business associates were expressing their disappointment in his behavior. Some were even talking about reconsidering their partnerships with him. His attempt to humiliate Victoria had instead revealed his own character flaws to everyone who mattered in his professional and social circles. But Blackwood surprised everyone, including himself, with what he did next. He walked slowly through the crowd until he reached Victoria, who was still surrounded by people offering her opportunities and support. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice completely different from the mocking tone he had used earlier. "I owe you an apology." The conversations around them stopped as people turned to listen. "What I did tonight was cruel and wrong," Blackwood continued, his face red with shame. "I judged you based on your job instead of your character and talent. You've shown more grace and dignity in the last 20 minutes than I've shown in years." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She could have said something angry, something that would have made him feel even worse. Instead, she did something that impressed everyone even more than her piano playing. "Thank you for the apology, Mr. Blackwood," she said simply. "And thank you for giving me the opportunity to play tonight. Sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected situations." 6 months later, Victoria was studying at one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country on a full scholarship. Her brother Miguel's medical bills were covered by donations from people who had seen the video of her performance. The clip had gone viral, viewed by millions of people around the world who were inspired by her story. Elena Vasquez became Victoria's mentor, helping her navigate the classical music world and connecting her with the best teachers and performance opportunities. David Rodriguez's foundation not only paid for her education, but also helped several other talented young musicians from similar backgrounds. Charles Blackwood, humbled by the experience, quietly began funding music education programs in low-income communities. He never spoke publicly about what had happened that night, but his actions showed he had learned something important about the difference between wealth and worth. And Victoria never forgot the lesson she learned that evening.